Hello, everybody, and welcome to Psyched Out, a podcast focused on all things psychology, like psychological thrillers, unethical experiments, true crime cults, and more. I am your host, Emily, and for those who don't know, I have a bachelor's degree in forensic psychology and a background in law enforcement. This helps me provide unique insight on some of the world's most famous cases, movies, and events. In today's episode, we'll be talking about the Netflix documentary, Trust Me, False Prophet. If you haven't seen the documentary, go watch it before listening because this is going to spoil some stuff. And if you have watched it already, I'll be doing a short timeline to act as a refresher. I got the timeline off the internet. But before we jump in, I do want to apologize. This video was supposed to come out last week. I had a bit of a situation where a rat got stuck in my kitchen wall, and I kind of had to take care of that. So I apologize, but thank you guys for waiting. If you like this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And without further ado, we're going to go ahead and jump in. So the key timeline of events begins in 2002 until 2011. It pertains to good old Warren Jeffs. At this time, Warren Jeffs runs the FLDS church, and then eventually he gets arrested in 2006 and ends up being convicted for sexual assault of children in 2011. During this time, he is the so-called prophet of the FLDS church. Everybody listens to him. He's basically like Jesus for the Mormons, the voice of God. Obviously, he did some very bad stuff, which is why he was in prison. Now, around this time, the government really interfered with the FLDS, started evicting people from their homes, etc. In my opinion, a little bit of an overreach for the government. I understand that they were looking out for the kids and wanting to make sure that this problem didn't get out of hand anymore, but at the same time and place. One thing I do want to give this documentary credit for is the fact that it really kind of showed that not every FLDS member is what the mainstream media wants you to think. Some of them do critically think. Some of them do go against the norm, etc. And I think that did a really good job of giving them fair representation, because I myself was a little bit biased when it came to the community and trying to understand them. And that was from my own ignorance. And I think that this documentary helped educate me a little bit on the fact that that's not necessarily the case. So while Warren Jeffs was in prison for the first little bit, he was actually giving messages to his followers from prison, but at a certain point, this stopped. And he basically told everybody before his communication ended, you're not allowed to have kids, you're not allowed to marry, you're not allowed to have sex. And obviously, that's going to be kind of a hard thing for a community to grasp when that's really what they've been doing for the last, however many decades. To suddenly take that away from them, that's a big issue. On top of that, there is a massive power vacuum now with Warren Jeffs being gone. There's no guidance. There is no leader. Now, he's not dead, which complicates things as well, because inserting yourself as the new prophet can be seen as blasphemous, etc., which ends up being Sam's case later on, and why he didn't really develop as many followers as I think he would have liked. So think of it as sort of like a political way. Anytime that a country has, a very prominent dictator-like leader, whenever that leader goes away, there's a power vacuum. It gets pretty chaotic. The people don't know what to do. The government doesn't know what to do, etc. So it's very similar in this situation. Now, in 2016, cult expert Dr. Christine Marie and her husband Tolga moved to the Short Creek area of Utah, a tight-knit polygamous community where they begin to notice Sam Bateman's rising influence. Now, I do want to say Christine having a psychology degree in cults is actually really cool. Like I say in the intro, my degree is in forensic psychology, and I took a class on cults, and it's very interesting. But I really want to commend her for taking such a bad experience in her own life and being able to turn that around to help other people, and also not judging the FLDS community. Like I said, I myself have judged the FLDS community. I am a human being. I am not any more righteous than anybody else. But she saw a need, and she saw people that, were kind of being bullied by the government when a vast majority of them really weren't responsible for what Warren Jeffs was doing to children and didn't have any direct link to that. So she, in my opinion, is probably a better person than I am, and I really want to commend her for that. So then we move to 2017. Murray and Tolga meet Bateman, and they begin to suspect him of abusing his position, that of this new self-proclaimed prophet, which eventually leads them to investigate him and his associates while being undercover. And I think that Christine, because of her own experience, was honestly the best option for this to happen. I don't think anybody else would have been able to pull it off the way that she did. And I really want to commend her for seeing the red flags and the warning signs as quick as she did, because it would have been really easy for her to try and push that off and say, well, I'm not part of the community, I don't know, etc. Now, then in 2019 to 2022, under the guise of filming a documentary on his teaching, Marie and Tolga document Bateman's abuse, including sexual abuse of minors and his intense indoctrination. Then in September of 2022, Sam Bateman is arrested by the FBI in Arizona following the evidence collected by Marie and her husband Tolga. November 2022, followers of Bateman, who are still loyal to him, attempt to take the underage victims who had been placed in the custody of the Arizona Department of Child Safety, leading to a chase across multiple states, including California and Washington. Which, don't even get me started on CPS, or I guess it's DCS now. They're a joke. The fact that they had all of the kids together in the first place, like, I understand wanting to keep them together because that's their family, but also they should have suspected that something like this was going to happen. And the fact that they didn't is ridiculous. And then also the fact that they ended up outing Christine and Julia, who also, shout out to Julia for getting her shit together. Obviously, she did some not so great things and allowed some not so great things to happen, but she's really the catalyst that allowed this case to move forward, because Christine Marie never would have been able to do what she did without Julia. So really quick shout out to Julia. But DCS definitely fumbled, which, big surprise. That whole system needs to be remodeled, in my opinion. I doubt that'll ever happen because it's so ingrained in its current state. But I have my own personal experiences with DCS, and they're not great. So DCS sucks. And then also, really quick, while we're on the topic of like organizations and stuff, I just want to take a second to talk about how much the cop, not Dawn, the FBI agent, she was great, but how much that male cop pissed me off, because he really didn't take initiative on this case at all. And I work in law enforcement, so I think I could talk to this a little bit. When somebody has an audio recording saying, yeah, I let grown men have sex with girls, you should probably start an investigation immediately. You don't just say, oh, well, that's not enough, etc. Now, I understand not wanting to arrest him right away because you want to build a case, and sometimes that's just how it works. But the fact that he didn't really give a shit really makes me upset. And then the fact that he openly admitted in the interview that he only listened to the recording once because it made him uncomfortable and it was going to upset him. And, that would be really hard for him to take and to handle because he has such a gentle soul. That is your job. Okay. Over the weekend, I myself saw a 9-minute recording for a case that I'm working that honestly was pretty gross and it disgusted me. But you know how many times I watched it so that I could write a good report? Probably 10, because that is my job and that is what I signed up to do, to protect and serve the community. So yeah, it's going to make you uncomfortable, but that's your fucking job. So cry me a river, dude. He absolutely irritated the hell out of me. And the fact that it was Christine who had to mention to him that this case should go to the FBI is fucking ridiculous. And honestly, Bateman's abuse of these children went on way longer than it needed to if this guy had gotten his head out of his ass. I think his name's Sergeant Wilkinson, who, whatever the hell his name is, fuck that guy, he sucks. Okay, moving on. December of 2024, Bateman is ultimately sentenced to 50 years in prison for conspiracy to commit transportation of a minor for criminal sexual activity and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. And then April 8th, 2026, Trust Me, the False Prophet is released on Netflix, highlighting the investigation and the survivors of the group. So now that we have that covered, the general timeline, some of my thoughts and feelings surrounding the key players in this, here's what I really want to discuss when it comes to this video/podcast episode. Number one, I really want to talk about cult tactics and some general cult history. I also want to talk about the way that Sam used common grooming tactics and then was able to refine them to be used specifically through religion. And then lastly, I want to talk about some of Sam's own behaviors and really just talk about why he actually is as much of a loser as he tried not to be, and why so many people in the FLDS community clocked that he was a schmuck and nobody really liked him. So before we jump into the brainwashing techniques, we have some things that we kind of have to acknowledge and recognize when it comes to cult history and how that influences cult tactics. First and foremost, cult groups are predominantly headed by men, and they are initially composed of female followers. Sometimes it's composed of male followers, but typically the system is you have a male cult leader who gets some wayward souls, typically women. And then at that point, those women are violently abused, manipulated, sexually abused, physically, emotionally, and mentally. And all of this is done for the gratification of the male leaders that are, in a weird way, responsible for them, but they also serve that leader. This sentiment comes from a study by Wistet and Post-Rosow. I think that's how you say it. My resources are going to be in the description as usual. So if you want to read some of these studies, by all means, go ahead. Now, when we look at cults, naming some of them, like off the top of my head, we have obviously the Manson family, we have Jonestown, we have Warren Jeffs, and obviously we have Sam Bateman. All of these are led by men. And there are absolutely female cult leaders, but it's a much smaller number, like a significantly less margin, which is ultimately going to influence how cult leaders operate and how cults' tactics are documented. So, like, the research isn't really going to have much of a say on what female cult leaders do compared to male cult leaders, just because there's not a significant sample size. Additionally, cults will often use their female members to recruit others. And while it's unclear as to what the sole motivation of this is, I think we can speculate that it boils down to a couple of reasons. Number one, children and adolescents are taught to trust women at a very young age. I was taught that. It was always, hey, if you're in trouble, you find a woman, and the best woman you could find is someone with a kid. But you would never go to a man if you needed help because men are inherently unsafe or unpredictable. And this mentality is shared by adults as well, which is how it gets passed on to children and teenagers, etc. Then we have the second reason, which is that women aren't really seen as nefarious or deceptive individuals at face value. Are we capable of that? Absolutely. There's some very awful women historically in the true crime world who just suck. But again, it leads into point one where kids are taught this. And I think part of that's because society doesn't really see women as these big, giant, evil monsters. Then we have the third point, which is that a male trying to recruit another woman may cause that woman to be uneasy and inherently refuse. And so women who are seen as less threatening are therefore going to have an easier time accessing and gaining trust and having conversations with both men and women, whereas a male trying to recruit a woman may result in like some red flags that woman senses where she might not be that uneasy when it comes to a fellow woman. Because women also have this idea that like, oh, well, another woman's she's not going to lead me astray to where I'm going to be sexually abused, right? Like we kind of have this understanding that for the most part, women want to protect each other from sexual abuse. It doesn't matter how much you hate them. You don't want that to happen to them because to us, that's like the worst thing that could ever happen to you. So that's kind of my hypothesis as to why that seems to be the history surrounding cults and their recruitment process. Again, I don't see a study that confirms this, but I do think it's not too big of a jump to come to those conclusions. Now, how all of this pertains to the FLDS and Samuel Bateman in particular is that by initially marrying young adult women, he's then able to gain the trust of other young girls in turn, both within the community and within the families that he's already married into. Now, the interesting thing is that he doesn't have to outright recruit people the way that traditional cults would. When we think about like Manson or Jonestown, these were all outsiders being brought in. Now, the FLDS in and of itself doesn't have to outsource to external communities to get members. They very much stay within their own community and within their own religion specifically. And in many instances, the reason people like Warren Jeffs get power and Sam Bateman get power is because they essentially birth people into this cult. And, you know, you're not having to change the thought process that they've had for 15 years. You can mold the child into what you want the moment that they're born. And so this is particularly interesting because it's almost isolated to specifically the FLDS. We see it all the time when it comes to these particular cults. So essentially what that means is that they have a constant supply and influx of new members, which significantly decreases and mitigates the complexity of the brainwashing process. Now, how is indoctrination obtained? Well, we have to look at a special little thing that we call Maslow's hierarchy of needs in the psychology world, something that was particularly interesting when I learned it in college. I want to say I learned it in Psych 101. So it's kind of a basic level concept, but it's been widely accepted. So Abraham Maslow proposed in 1943 that human needs were arranged in a hierarchical system. This system is often illustrated as a pyramid. So it's sort of like the food pyramid that you see where you're like, you're supposed to eat this many carbs and this many vegetables, except it's based on psychology and not food. Basically, the way this works is that the more basic needs for survival are at the bottom, and then up at the top is more of not like higher class, but more difficult to achieve psychological needs. And you have to meet the lower needs before you get to the higher needs. So you have to go from the bottom to the top. You can't skip around and turn it into a little hopscotch game. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs is basically an outline of the required need fulfillment categories to become a self-actualized individual or completely fulfilled. This is defined by McLeod in 2024. It helps explain why children who experience abuse may lack certain aspects of identity. For instance, the top part of the pyramid is self-actualization, and the bottom is physiological. So it goes physiological, safety, love/belonging, esteem, like self-esteem, and then finally self-actualization. And so if a kid doesn't feel safe, then they won't have their need of belonging or love met. So they can't move up, right? So they may have their physiological needs met, which is great, which can then maybe help them feel safe. But if they don't have that feeling of safety, they're not going to feel love and they're not going to feel like they belong in their own home, which in turn leads to low self-esteem and a lack of self-actualization because you didn't go through the necessary steps to get to those categories and fulfill those. So basically what the cult ideology does is it creates a system that weaponizes this hierarchy of needs where the cult leader is the only person who can help people reach self-actualization because they are solely responsible for each step in the hierarchy. So we're going to kind of examine this through the lens of Samuel Bateman. We're going to start with the physiological needs, for example, food, water, sleep, a house, things like that. So by marrying all of these young girls and having these girls given to him by their fathers, he then becomes the sole provider. And being young and unable to support themselves, Sam then becomes responsible for fulfilling those physiological needs because otherwise they're not going to be met. These girls cannot take care of it themselves. They depend solely on Sam for food, for water, for shelter, for a place to sleep, etc. And then once Sam establishes control over these physiological needs, the girls can't exactly leave or they're going to lose access to basic needs like food and water and shelter. So they're kind of stuck at that point. Then we have safety. So being young and vulnerable, the girls need a place to feel safe and secure. That would be with Sam because, again, he provides all of their physiological needs. And then on top of that, their parents, their biological parents, even though they technically, quote, belong to Sam at this point, still live in the same household. And part of being safe or secure is having access to the things that meet their physiological needs, like I said. On top of that, humans crave routine and predictability because it helps them feel secure. We are creatures of habit. There's a reason that saying exists. So Sam having control over the girls' daily activities gives them the guidance that they crave. And by the way, when it comes to childhood development, kids not only need structure, but they crave it. And so them being as young as they were kind of lends into Sam's ultimate control over them because he's providing them what they innately need. So it really just makes it worse for them, and it makes it more... It makes it easier for Sam to do the manipulation that he's doing. Next, we have love and belonging. And because these girls' needs are being met in a weird, twisted kind of way, they transition into this strange space where they feel a sense of belonging and they feel a sense of love for Sam. What that would typically be is like this love for someone who is a provider, the way that you would feel towards a parent. Like, thank you, mom and dad. I love that you take care of me. Like, I really appreciate it. You make me feel safe. You make me feel like I belong. Well, Sam weaponizes that natural feeling that kids are going to have. And then instead of using it in a way that a parental figure might, which is like, hey, I appreciate that. I expect you to do your chores around the house, etc. He turns it into something that it isn't or something that it shouldn't be. And being the self-proclaimed prophet, he really becomes an idol to these children. They want to belong to the prophet and they want to be loved by the prophet. So it moves beyond this weird parental affection into this obsessive, religious-oriented love that Sam can take advantage of. And with Sam giving them attention and loving them in a very inappropriate way, he's really giving them that next tier of the hierarchy, even though it's inappropriate. He understands that these girls want to belong to something, that they want to be loved and nurtured. And then rather than engage in that in a way like a normal adult would, by supporting them from a distance or the way a parent would, he changes that to benefit him from a very religious perspective. I could go on throughout the whole Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but I think you guys get the idea. Now, outside of weaponizing Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we see tactics within cults like isolation, sleep deprivation, exhaustion, etc. Cults intentionally isolate their members from their families and their old identities, even going so far as to change people's names at times, which is something that Sam openly admits in the documentary that he did with one of the victims. And he boasts like, oh, well, she wasn't even bothered by it, and everybody just kind of laughs. That's a huge red flag. He has effectively stripped that individual of any like self-identifying marker. He basically said, hey, the name that your parents gave you sucks. So I'm going to give you a new name. And it's really shitty that happened. But again, it's something that cults and cult leaders do. Once the old identity is stripped and the victim is effectively isolated, the cult leader can then carefully construct a sense of belonging that pertains only to their own desires. It's why Sam made the children his wives and took them from their parents. He was making them leave their old identity where they were a child and they were being parented and force them to leave that behind and become established in this new embroiled sense of belonging as a wife instead. And taking on the identity of a wife, accepting that role as a wife would mean some of the weird stuff that he's going to do to them and the inappropriate and criminal behavior he's going to do to them is somehow more acceptable than if they were still in the identity of I am a child, not a wife. As for sleep deprivation, there isn't any like apparent evidence of that in the documentary. I just bring it up because it's something that's common in cults. And to be honest, it wouldn't surprise me if he did something like that. We just don't know about it. Then we have exhaustion. So Sam kept the girls working pretty much all day, every day, whether they were sick, whether they were pregnant, whatever it was, they were out working to support him financially. And he took all of their money and all of that went to him because, well, I'm providing for you. You need to give me the money and I'm the profit and then we'll, do X, Y, and Z. So again, more isolation, more loss of identity. They can't provide for themselves, manipulation of Maslow's hierarchy, etc. You kind of see how all of this like folds in on itself. Now, on top of this, these girls, these children are taking care of babies. They're being used as sex slaves. They're being pestered all the time by these hours-long religious teachings. And this is intentional because when the human body and the mind are exhausted, they become much more pliable. Thought processes slow down. Your whole body slows down. You get brain fog. Like your critical thinking just goes out the freaking window. You're not going to be able to say, hey, that's a red flag. I don't really like that because you're so tired. You're almost at a point where you'll just accept pretty much anything. Then we have another common tactic within cults, which is an us versus them mentality, something that Sam constructed within the FLDS. Remember, like he at this time, he was an outsider within his own community, and he didn't like it. And so he painted other FLDS members as being the bad guys as well. Like they didn't understand what he was doing. They weren't accepting him as the prophet. So therefore, that's shameful and that's evil and they're all going to go to hell. Now, on top of that, the FLDS as a whole has this problem because they don't trust outsiders and they don't trust law enforcement, things like that. Now, later in the documentary, when search warrants are being served by the FBI, we see how quickly this mentality of an us versus them spirals out of control because all of a sudden you have these minor children being like, oh my God, we have to fight the government. We need to get guns. They're never going to take us alive. And that's partially because Sam created this us versus them mentality of they're never going to understand this. We're going to be the bad guys. We're not the bad guys. We're not doing anything wrong. When in reality, he is the bad guy and he is doing stuff that is wrong. Like, he knows that, but he's playing it off in the sense that he's just this innocent individual. It's also why all of the victims were so quick to lie about their experiences with Sam and how easy it was for Sam to paint himself as a martyr once he got arrested. We also have to consider the prevalence of love bombing, especially in Sam's context. This is another tactic that is seen in cults. So, especially on the smaller side, what the leader will express is just unabashed love and affection very quickly for new members or members in general. And they do this without a lot of restraint. And they do this to help portray to the new members how much they actually care, how much of a good person they are. It's behavior that is very typical in abusive relationships because honestly, that's what it is. These behaviors are also seen in narcissistic individuals, which cult leaders typically fall under. In fact, Oakes 1997 and Olson 2011 explained that charisma, from a psychological perspective, is predicated on the foundation of narcissism or narcissistic personality disorder. This is important because most cult leaders depend on their charisma to manipulate their members and even gather new recruits. Due to the abusive circumstances of the cults, another thing we have to consider is that some psychologists posit that cults are a strange representation of Stockholm Syndrome. By all accounts and purposes, or all intents and purposes, these victims are being abused, and yet they're staying with the abuser and even loving and defending the abuser. We see that in Sam's case, where they're willing to try and shoot the federal government so that they can get him out of jail. They're willing to kidnap the children and some of their siblings because Sam asks them to. Like, there are so many layers here, so much context. And at face value, the whole Stockholm Syndrome actually makes a lot of sense, like that whole theory. Now, one thing I do want to focus on, which I discussed earlier, is that many cults use grooming tactics, but they're able to alter it in a way where it can fit their needs for whatever their purpose is, which is honestly what Sam did. And if you've watched my grooming video on YouTube or you've listened to the episode on the podcast, some of what I'm going to say is going to sound familiar, but I want to talk about what the tactic is and how Sam kind of weaponized it to fit within this religious, not spectacle, but persona that he built for himself. So groomers will target families before the children in some cases. So they will seek out a family and say, I like that kid, let me befriend the parents. Once I befriend the parents, then I can target the kid. And this is exactly what Sam did by targeting the fathers of the children he would go on to marry. How he did this was exclusively through their religion and then posing as the prophet. And the documentary makes it clear that Sam was the laughingstock of the community and that, frankly, none of the members, even the women outside of his own little cult, respected him. They all thought he was a schmuck. They hated him. He thought he was ridiculous. And to a narcissistic person, that's going to suck. And the only way he could get access to anybody at that point, because everybody thought he was so stupid, was by going to a family, and then once he befriended that family, he could have access to their children through the father. And the only way anyone would actually give him the time of day is if he were somehow doing it for a religious perspective, a religious purpose, or if he posed as the prophet, which he ultimately did. Another thing that Sam does, and another grooming tactic, is people who emotionally identify with youth. And this is something that I'm going to kind of break down a little bit more when I talk about Sam directly. But most groomers are able to communicate with kids better than adults. Sam clearly demonstrates this because first of all, the way he talks to people is just really bothersome. But he goes out of his way to acknowledge the children before he acknowledges the adults. But the way that he does this is because he puts an intense focus on communicating with the kids as like a religious exercise, or that he's being a mentor trying to save them. And he's the prophet. He's just trying to educate them on what God wants them to do. So they have to listen to him. So that's kind of how he gets around that, where it's a built-in excuse of like, oh, well, I'm doing it for religious purposes. I want to save their souls. I'm the prophet. Then we have gift giving. So Sam buying Bentleys, getting a large house, etc. is sort of a semblance of gift giving. Now, part of that's the narcissism where he's getting all of this stuff for himself. But then he goes on to get the girls' wedding rings, and then he'll take some of them out to shoot. He buys some of them guns, etc. You know, this is gift giving. It's in a very controlled setting, but it's all done behind this religious facade of like, well, God supports families living together in one house, so we're all going to live in this house that I bought together, and someday I'm going to build us a mansion. Or, you know, God wants his children to be loved and cared for, so therefore, you know, all of these things that I'm getting for you, these Bentleys, this is me taking care of you. On top of that, we have Sam buying girls' wedding rings, different things like that. Like, It's honestly, it boils down to, most of this boils down to Sam being like, hey, I'm the prophet. If I give you X, Y, or Z, or I do X, Y, or Z, it's excusable. Whereas in a more traditional setting, a guy who's like, hey, give me all this money, I'm going to go buy us a Bentley, that's weird. That should be a very big red flag. But that's not the case here because he's weaponizing it through religion. Another thing that kind of falls into gift giving is like the trips that he would take, where he would take the girls out of state and, they really wouldn't have done this otherwise because the FLDS community in and of itself is so isolated. But Sam was able to present it in a way where it's somehow relevant to his mission as the prophet, when in reality, he's just using it in a way to sex traffic people and sex traffic the kids. But the kids don't know this, or at least don't comprehend this. To them, they're just like, oh, sick. This is a vacation or a trip that we're not going to have if, we weren't with Sam. Like, Sam is such a good husband. Sam is so great. In reality, Sam is just weaponizing the religion to do what he wants, how he wants. And the kids don't know, because how else are they supposed to? Then we have the weaponizing of sex and affection, which boils down to the FLDS system of listen to your husband no matter what, or listen to the prophet no matter what. And posing as the prophet let Sam do whatever he wanted to those girls. And we have to keep in mind that these kids were so eager to partake in whatever it is that their religion asked of them. And I don't mean that in the way that like, oh, well, they were so excited to be raped by Sam. I mean that in the way like they are young girls who are so excited to love God, to have a relationship with God. They want to be good people who are following their religion and doing what they're supposed to be. Like, they're eager. They want to be good people in the eyes of the Lord. And so when Sam's like, oh, I'm the prophet and God wants you to do this, they're going to be more accepting of that. Not saying that they deserve it, but like the hairs that are supposed to stand up on the back of your neck are not going to do that as much when you're under the impression that like you are fulfilling the religion and its aspects that you were supposed to be fulfilling. And so we also have to keep in mind that if I recall correctly, the youngest wife is 9. And at 9 years old, you're going to listen to just about anything that any adult tells you to, no matter what it is, because you're 9. Some additional points of grooming, and honestly, the cult brainwashing as a whole, are the religious sermons and writings that Sam did. Sam keeping young children who by all means have lots of energy and would probably love to be playing outside in a house cooped up for hours where they're writing testimonials and sentences he made up about himself is honestly diabolical. It allowed him to control their way of thinking. Basically, if you write the same thing over and over again, like I love Sam or Sam is the prophet thousands of times, at some point it becomes ingrained in your mind. Like, there was a thought experiment I did in psych where it was basically like, say the word door 300 times. At some point, your brain's going to get weirded out and be like, well, is that a word? Is door a word? Am I pronouncing that correctly? Like, your brain gets so easily manipulated by words, by sentences, by thoughts that you say over and over and over and over and over again. That's just how it is. That's why, like, negative talk, if somebody's always saying, oh, you're too fat, you're too fat, you're too fat, you're too fat, that's how eating disorders happen, right? Like, at some point, your brain internalizes the things that you hear or the things that you write or the things that you say over and over and over and over again. And that is exactly what Sam was doing. This allowed Sam to further his control and groom the girls into believing that he was the prophet and that they actually did love him. And this in turn allowed him to shape their religious experience to fit what he wanted so that he could control them further. And the thing that sucks is like all of this makes Sam seem like a really smart individual, when in reality, he's just a giant fucking loser. And so I really want to talk about some of his behaviors in the documentary and really highlight how much of a bum he actually is. So one thing that predators are really good at, as I mentioned in the grooming section, is socializing with children. One thing they absolutely suck at is socializing with adults or their peers. In a way, they are socially and emotionally stunted. Because we have to remember that Sam was a joke to the rest of the FLDS community. He was not a man of status, and to be honest, nobody liked him and nobody cared about him. In fact, people still didn't like him outside of his cult of the Samuelites. Like, he was hot shit within the Samuelites, but outside of that, nobody cared about him. Nobody gave a flying fuck about who Sam was. And you can see that he talks more with the kids than he does with the adults. And even when he talks with the adults like Christine, he has this weird infantilizing nature about how he talks and the way that he talks. He always talks in this stupidly soft, like aloof voice along the lines of like, oh, silly me, I'm just a humble, innocent man. I'm just trying to do right by God. And to be honest, it's annoying as fuck. But he does this intentionally because he's trying to present himself as unassuming, but any grown adult can look at that and say that's fake. It's no different than Michelle Duggar and how she talks. It's the same sentiment. But any adult looks at it and goes, yeah, that's stupid. There's no way that you actually talk like that. On top of this, Sam literally acts like a child in a lot of ways. So there's this clip going around, and I understand why it's so funny because it's him doing his like weird little parkour hiking trick. And it's like a kid showing their mom a backflip in the pool. They're like, Mom, watch me do a backflip. And they actually do a cannonball, and it's just stupid and ridiculous. And the kid is like 6 years old. On top of, like, additionally, there's his delusion of meeting the queen, which is also stupid and super juvenile in nature. Like, he's legitimately just a grown-up man baby. He cannot function or act like an adult despite being one. And it's not that he can't do this. It's that he fundamentally doesn't know how to do it successfully to fulfill his narcissistic desires, right? Because if he acts like an adult amongst his peers and he acts as narcissistic and petulant as he actually is, his peers are going to look at him and be like, dude, what the fuck? But kids aren't going to be the same way because kids don't know any better. And so it's so much easier for him to go, oh, well, these kids are going to think it's cool if I climb up these rocks because kids think that shit's cool and kids do that. Whereas adults are going to be like, this is the dumbest shit that I've ever seen in my life. And speaking of narcissism, Sam is incredibly narcissistic. All of the money, all of the cars, all of the houses, all of it was paid for by the girls who were working, and he took all of that. And to be honest, they say in the documentary that it was just a giant middle finger to everybody who didn't like him, and it was. But the funny thing is nobody else cared. Sam is the one that cared. Nobody else gave a shit. They were all just out there living their own lives. And then with Sam messaging Christine and Tolga to be like, oh, come film me and film everything I did, is such a narcissistic behavior that it became less of like, hey, they're documenting what the FLDS community is really like and giving people a voice that otherwise don't have a voice, to, hey, this is going to be like a sitcom show about me and all about me, and everybody else sucks. One thing that is just so annoying to me too is that he went around and posed all of these ideas that he allegedly came up with as like original content, when in reality he pulled all of this from Warren Jeff's own diaries and he used somebody else's playbook. I'm not saying that he should be doing any of this, but at the very least, come up with your own shit, dude. Like, come on. And then another thing that really shocked me and like really drove home this point of just how narcissistic Sam actually is and how childlike he actually is in one of his diary entries, he talks about punishing one of the men in the Samuelites because this man did something he didn't like and then therefore defied God, which very clearly insinuated that Sam sees himself as a direct representation of God. He's not this prophet that's getting words from Jeff beyond the graves, born just beyond the grave, and like verbalizing it, or getting messages from God and verbalizing it. He sees himself as God. He's pretending to be a prophet. So in total, like, the narcissism combined with the charisma makes him genuinely insufferable. But then you add in the weird infantilizing nature that he carries himself with. Additionally, he's a pedophile. So like, he has a lot going on that's just really infuriating, and like, it was very difficult for me to watch the documentary because of how annoying he was. But one thing that I feel the documentary highlights is how easy it is to establish this type of control within the FLDS community. And it's sad because until they start to shift how they do things, there's always going to be a predatory environment within the FLDS community. That's why it was so easy for things to shift from Warren Jeffs to Sam. Now there's another power vacuum. Like, it's just poor souls and individuals who are ripe for the taking. And what sucks is their religion and their culture makes it possible for this to happen. And I feel bad saying that because, like I said, this documentary helped me understand that, like, not every member of the FLDS community is like this. Not every member of the FLDS community doesn't have a brain, etc. But there's a reason that certain stereotypes exist. And unfortunately, with people like Sam always being in this type of community, people like Warren Jeffs always being in this type of community, it's only a matter of time before we get another situation like this and another documentary. And frankly, I don't really know how to fix it. I don't know if there is a solution. But one thing that I do want to talk about is Naomi and how she was able to come out of this having deconstructed everything. Because what's really interesting is that the way that people integrate you into a cult, the way that they brainwash you, you almost have to follow the exact same steps to get unbrainwashed, right? So her going to prison, okay? Isolation. She's isolated from Sam. She doesn't have him constantly yapping in her ear. Exhaustion. Some people have a very hard time in prison until they adjust. They're tired all the time. They can't sleep because it's a new environment. They're stressed, right? The food isn't great. That's another thing that cults do. Not necessarily within SAM or the FLDS, but a lot of cults will restrict food or give people very undernourishing meals. Prison's the same way. So it almost was a complete reversal of the process that got her involved in the first place, that got her out, which is particularly interesting. I wish I still had a flow diagram from my class on cults because it really broke down the specific steps and then what the reversal process was like. I don't know if I'd be able to find that in post, but I will try because I think it's particularly interesting. And the last thing I want to talk about is just something that I want people to consider. And it's something that I've talked about on my TikTok quite a lot, which is that, you know, a lot of people are really gung-ho about death to pedophiles and that all pedophiles should have the death penalty. And I'll be honest, I used to firmly believe that. I thought that was a great idea. I didn't see a problem with it. But I've seen a lot of discussion about it. And the more I think about it, the more I think it'll do more harm than good. Because number one, death penalty cases, right? Automatic appeals. So you're talking like 20 years of appeals and court processes where the victims are constantly going to have to go through this. Then you have to think about the fact that most victims know the person who did this to them. And so if it's like Uncle Smith or whatever, or Uncle Sam, if you will, they're not going to want to tattle on this guy because they know that they're going to get the death penalty and therefore be somehow responsible for the death of their relative, who they probably do care about to a certain extent. And then another thing, which is that perpetrators and predators are going to be more likely to kill their victims when they otherwise wouldn't because they can't afford these victims to go and tell people because then they get the death penalty for it. And while watching this documentary, when Sam gets everybody into the trailer and moves or tries to move when the FBI is closing in, I had this epiphany of, well, if the death penalty were a thing and Sam knew he was going to get caught and he knew he was going to get the death penalty, he would have committed a Jonestown. He would have had all of those girls, all of those kids drink the Kool-Aid because that is the type of man that he is. He would have done that. I don't feel like that's an inaccurate statement. So I just want to encourage people to think about, you know, maybe not pushing for that. Again, I understand the sentiment behind it, but I do think we need better legislation for pedophiles. I think we need harsher punishments, but I also don't think that the death penalty is the end-all, be-all, fix-all cure that people are making it out to be. And so that's just something that I want to bring up as like a point of education and a point of discussion, because I think discourse is healthy when it's done respectfully, and we're all trying to better the community. I think that's about it about everything that I have for this particular episode. Again, I apologize for getting it out late. But thank you guys for being here. If you want more content like this, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'm not sure what I'm going to do my next week video on, but we shall see. In the meantime, please take care of yourselves, guys. Stay safe out there and stay psyched out.